Okay, so we are, first of all, thank you for joining. We're beginning the portion of Vayetze, which is the portion that happens to be the weekly portion. So everybody caught up to us. That's good for them. So I'm excited about that we get to learn also the weekly Parsha today on Sunday. Just want to mention one thing, a few points from last week's, in other words, the conclusion of last week's Parsha, what we're up to. I'm going to try to be brief because, again, I want to focus on what is the beginning of this week's Parsha. So we'll see how far we get. Just a few points on the previous portion. So share the screen. Okay, so the narrative is that Rebecca tells her husband that she doesn't want her son marrying the local girls. So the father, Isaac, calls Jacob and he gives him tremendous blessings, the blessings of Abraham. And then he says, go to your uncle's home and there you'll find a wife. So if you look at, for example, chapter 20, what are we at? Chapter 28, verse 1, 2, and 3. And Isaac called Jacob and blessed him, and he commanded him and said to him, you shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself from there a wife of the daughters of Lavan, your mother's brother. And may the Almighty God bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and you shall become an assembly of peoples. And may he give you the blessing of Abraham to you and to your seed with you, that you may inherit the land of your sojournings, which God gave to Abraham. Okay, so we have tremendous blessings. And without rehashing everything, it's clear that at least at this point, Isaac is blessing Jacob knowingly. So it's not just a trick. Okay, fine. So he sends him away. Isaac sends Jacob and he goes. Okay, so the first thing is that's the story. And the next parsha, which begins in verse 10, picks up where Jacob is leaving the land of Israel and going to Haran, border of Turkey and Iraq, according to most people, most scholars. And he's there, and he ends up, to go find a wife. But now we have a little shift to the story of Esau. And look at verse 6. Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take himself a wife from there. And that when he blessed him, he commanded him, saying, you shall not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan. So Esau hears the news. What's the news? Newsflash, my father is not happy with the local girls. Now, who was Esau married to? Esau was married to Hittite girls. Hittim was one of the 7 nations that were in the land of Israel. So Esau says, oh, my father is not happy. Well, so what's interesting is that we already know, if we turn back one chapter, turning back to chapter 27, and you go all the way to I went to 28. If you go back to chapter 27, really the end of chapter 26, that is, all the way at the end of chapter 26, verse 34, and Esau was 40 years old, and he married Judith, the daughter of the Eri, the Hittite, and Basmat, the daughter of Elon, the Hittite. So he's marrying Canaanite girls. In other words, Canaan is the general nation, but the local girls. Hittim is one of the 7 nations in Israel, and they were a vexation of the spirit to Isaac and to Rebekah. So it's clear that Isaac and Rebekah did not like them. In other words, they made them a lot of heartache. Why? We know they were idol worshippers, but this is not a secret. This didn't start now. So this is for quite a while. Isaac and Rebekah have daughters-in-law from the daughters of Canaan, and they're very unhappy. But for whatever reason, either Esau is not aware of it, or nobody has said anything to him. I don't know. At this point, when Esau hears, my father sent away my brother, And he told him, don't marry first of all, he blessed him. And then he said, don't marry a girl from Canaan. Now Esav realizes, oh, dad's not happy. So let's see what he does. Go ahead, Vicky.
I had a question. Is there any significance of Esav marrying two wives at once, and Jacob only wanted to marry one and only like forced to marry the second?
Yes, don't worry, he's going to marry a third one, Esav. So the polygamy in the Bible is something that, even though it was permitted in biblical times, it was not something that was positive. And if you look at the patriarchs, whenever there was polygamy in the home, it created a tremendous amount of pain. And it was always a last resort. With Esav, it doesn't seem like it's a last resort. It seems like that's what he wants to do. It's more fun and exciting. That's what it is. I'm not.
Character, maybe, like speaks.
So it speaks to the character. It also speaks to the idea that we are already. Remember, I'm trying to paint it as if Esav doesn't know that there's a problem with the local girls. But if he doesn't know, why doesn't he know? Why isn't he part of the family? Why didn't he study the Parsha of Eliezer? In other words, the whole family history is that even though we're migrants and we came to Canaan, the people in Canaan are completely corrupt. And therefore, when Esav's father needed a wife, Abraham sent Eliezer back to Haran, and that's the family story, right? This is the family story. So obviously, when you say Esav is marrying the Hittite girls, it's telling you, even before the story of the portion, even before we get to the portion of the blessings, this also may be part of the reason why Rebecca knows that Esav is not in tune to the family values, is the fact that you're saying he married two. Okay, two is, if one local girl is a trouble, two is double trouble. But the point here is he's out of touch with out of touch with the values of his family. But for whatever reason, at this time, finally he realized, he realized, he got the message, right? He got the message that the girls of Canaan, maybe it has to be said to him explicitly. Maybe that's part of the message. Maybe part of the message is, don't expect your kids to internalize the message just because you feel deeply about it. You have to verbalize it. Maybe that's a message. A lot of people, they have certain values and deeply held values, and they're so deep you don't articulate it because this is who I am. I don't have to articulate it. But then your children grow up and you say, what, you never heard about this from me? They say, no, you never spoke about it. I didn't speak about it because it's part of who I am. Okay, but that doesn't help anybody. So maybe that's the message. Maybe the message is you have to articulate it. At this point, Esav, for the first time, hears my father said, when he blessed Jacob, he said, don't marry girls from Canaan. And all of a sudden, he gets the message. Oh, so maybe that's the message. The message is that just because you have deeply held values, don't expect your children to appreciate that unless you convey it and you express it and you verbalize it. Oh, maybe that's the idea. In any case, what does he do? So he doesn't want to travel to Haran. Okay, it's too complicated. So what he does is he says, oh, I'm going to go to my cousin. So what does he do? Verse 6. So verse 8, and Esav saw that the daughters of Canaan were displeasing to his father Isaac. So Esav went to Yishmael, and he took Machalat, the daughter of Yishmael, the son of Abraham, the sister of Nevayot, in addition to his other wives as a wife. That's the end of last week's parsha. Now, what is this verse telling you? Is it telling you it's good, it's bad? So there's many ways to read it. First of all, she has a beautiful name, Machalat. Machalat, the daughter of Yishmael. Let's see what Rashi says. I'm pretty sure Rashi says it. If not, the Medrash says it. So we have to go to the Medrash. Says the Medrash. No, Rashi doesn't talk about it. Nah, very long Rashi. Very long Rashi. But that's the different thing. That's trying to get to the dates of when this happened. Okay. Machalat comes from the word machul, forgiven. And the Talmud says that a bride and groom, on the day of their wedding, all their sins are forgiven. So it's like Yom Kippur. It's like all the days are forgiven. How do you know? Because her name was Machalat. And the problem with the name Machalat is elsewhere the Torah refers to her as Basmat. So is she Basmat or is she Machalat? And the answer is her name is Basmat, but she gets married, now she's Machalat. Machalat is forgiveness. And the bride and groom, when they get married, all their sins are forgiven. That's what the Medrash says. So obviously it's something positive about her and about this union. She is the daughter of Yishmael, the granddaughter of Abraham. The problem, so that's a beautiful thing. The problem is in addition to his other wives. Right? That's what verse 9 says. So Esav went to Yishmael, the son of Machat, the daughter of Yishmael, the son of Abraham, the sister of Nebayot, in addition to his other wives. So in other words, he did not separate himself from the other wives, even though they were idol worshippers, etc. So in that sense, Esav is this more of a conflicted character. He's trying to do the right thing, but he's still difficult for him to pull away from the negative influences in his life. So again, this is not a judgment call. This is just, I'm just putting out here what the verse says. And it seems like the verse is telling you, no, don't worry. He did not, even though he saw that they're bad in his father's eyes, he didn't. So he wanted to bring a positive influence, which is daughter of Yishmael, grandson of Abraham, but it was in addition, not instead. So that's the description. There's a beautiful interpretation that I think I said last week, but I'll say it again. If you look at this story, this whole idea that Isaac sends Jacob to find a wife elsewhere was instigated, of course, by Rebecca. And Rebecca tells her son, her husband, Rebecca says like this, and Rebecca said to Isaac, I am disgusted with my life. This is very strong language. I'm not happy with the local girls. I am disgusted with my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heth, like these, from the daughters of the land, of what use is my life to me? My life has no value if Jacob marries the daughter, a local girl. So she obviously feels very, very strongly about the daughters of the daughters of the land. Yet, maybe it goes without saying, so it's obvious, but it's still interesting to say that her desire does not affect Esav. The mother obviously does not like the girls of Canaan, but that doesn't affect Esav. What affects Esav is Vayar Esav. Esav sees that the daughters of Canaan were displeasing to his father Isaac. Whoops. It doesn't say to his father and mother. It doesn't say to his mother. It says specifically to his father Isaac, right? Verse 8. And Esav saw that the daughters of Canaan were displeasing to his father Isaac. So it's obvious and it goes without saying, but it's still interesting to think about and reiterate, because he felt that we know that Isaac loved Esav in an extraordinary way. That's why Isaac ultimately was able to influence Esav. And Rebecca, okay, it doesn't say she didn't like Esav, but she obviously did not have that same love. She didn't show the same love to Esav as she did to Jacob. So therefore, her influence, her displeasure of the local girls did not affect Esav at all. And of course, the lesson is, if you want to influence somebody, they have to feel that you love them. And then maybe you stand a chance, maybe not fully. Isaac wasn't able to transform Esav. He couldn't get him to separate from those girls, his other wives, but at least bring the positive influence into his life, which was Machalat, a daughter of Yishmael. Kabbalistically, there's all kinds of interpretations of why he goes to Yishmael. Yishmael was also rejected, right? So Yishmael understood Esav. So that's one way to think about it. There's also a Kabbalistic interpretation which says that Abraham is kindness and Isaac is discipline, and Jacob is sort of a blend of the two, which is compassion, which maybe we'll talk about today, if not today, the next week. So in some ways, Esav, if he wants to counter Jacob, and that's the way it always works in this world, the opposite of holiness is always the mirror of holiness. So Esav also goes to Yishmael, and because he wants either consciously or subconsciously, he wants both qualities of judgment as well as kindness, because that's what the holiness has, and Esav will be the mirror image of Jacob. So when he goes to Yishmael, it's not just he's going to find a wife, but it's also he wants to incorporate some of Yishmael's character into his camp, into his culture. And in that way, he's trying to, it emphasizes Yishmael, the son of Abraham, right? Right? He says he took Machalat, the daughter of Yishmael, the son of Abraham. That emphasizes that he's trying to get the quality of Abraham, which is the kindness, whereas Esav is much more like his father Isaac, which is more the quality of judgment, as the Kabbalah explains. Okay, that is last week. That is last week. That was last parsha. Now we start the new parsha of Vayetze, and he left, and Jacob left Beersheba, and he went to Haran. This is chapter 10, new parsha of Vayetze. Okay, Mazel Tov. We finished the parsha. Should make a party. In elementary school, every time you finish a parsha, they make a party. So we have to make a party. So make sure you party today. Okay.
Can I ask you a question before we party?
We're always partying. But go ahead. Yes.
About the this chapter. So Isaac wasn't happy with daughters-in-law, but he didn't verbalize it before Rebecca said it.
I don't know. Maybe he did, but he didn't say it. Sometimes it doesn't say that he said it. Maybe he said it. I don't know. I can just tell you what it says, right? Nowhere does it say maybe he did. Maybe Esav wasn't paying attention. I don't know. I just know that this is the first time that it says that Esav, let's look at the verses. It sounds to me like to Esav this was news. I don't think it should be news. Well, if you're out in the field, maybe it's news. Nobody ever told it to you. Sometimes we don't say the most obvious things, but let's read the verse. Vayares, verse 6, chapter 28, verse 6. Vayares of Esav saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take himself a wife from there. And that when he blessed him, he commanded him, saying, "You shall not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan." So this is the information. The information is he blessed him, and he told him, I guess in conjunction with the blessing, right? We're putting those two concepts together in verse 6. He saw that he blessed Jacob. If I'm Esav, I expect my father to be upset at Jacob. Instead, he blessed him, and he told him, "Don't go to, don't marry from the local girls." So to Esav, okay, so Esav probably thinks that the blessing is because he's not going to marry the local girls. And to him, he says, maybe that's why my father didn't bless me and he blessed my younger brother. Maybe this whole thing is a conspiracy because he doesn't like the local girls and I married a local girl, right? If I'm Esav, this is what I'm thinking. But in verse 6, and Esav saw, and that Jacob listened to his father and his mother and he went to Padan Aram. And verse 8 is the summary. There's a lot of information in verse 6 and 7. So there's a lot to dissect. But the summary is, and Esav saw that the daughters of Canaan were displeasing to his father Isaac. Okay, I would think, look, this is Esav married at 40. I'm pretty sure Jacob got the blessings at 64. 24 years later. 24, if you do the math, in the end of Rashi, in the end of this parsha, Rashi does the math. So I think it's 24 years since Esav gets married until this story. 24 years later, he saw that the daughters of Canaan were displeasing to his father's Isaac. So why not? So maybe Isaac never verbalized it. Maybe he verbalized it, but Esav wasn't listening. Maybe Esav didn't realize how important it was to him until he didn't get the blessing. And then he thinks in his mind that he got that his father blessed Jacob because of the daughters. So I don't know. But it's interesting, the first time Isaac says something the first time there's a record, the Torah says that Isaac said something to either Esav or Jacob is right here in the story. And I'm saying at least the takeaway could be, a possible takeaway is, don't assume your kids think you share your values just because it's it's the forefront of your mind. Because to you this is so important, but they're another person. You have to verbalize, you have to speak your values.
And in addition to that, the kid has to have some incentive.
Oh, that's a separate problem. The question is if they're going to listen. That's so almost out of your power. Even when they listen, they may not listen fully because Esav doesn't really solve the problem. He goes and marries Machalat, Mazel Tov. So, but it doesn't solve the problem. He's still married to two girls, the daughters of what is it? I forgot. The Hittite. The bottom line is, so it's not whether or not they fully adapt what your values is a different story. But my takeaway for myself. I'm not saying Esav. I'm just learning what can I, sitting here in 2022, I think it was still 2022. Yeah, 2022. What could I take away from the story today? I didn't think about this before, but yes, verbalize your values. Whether or not they adapt it, that's beyond your power. But you have to speak. You have to speak your values. Don't assume that because this is important to me, it's going to be important to them. And that's why my mother, maybe that's not why, I don't know why, but my mother, she constantly repeats their same stories. And she says all the stories of her growing up and her grandparents and how they sacrificed to live a religious lifestyle in America in the late 20s and early 30s. And she keeps telling the same stories. And you're like rolling your eyes. I heard the story a million times. But that's the story. That's what you have to do. You have to verbalize. You have to tell. No one is going to know it otherwise. In other words, don't assume that because these stories are important to you, that your children are going to be conscious of that. Maybe yeah, maybe no, but you have to do your part and you have to speak. So that's a takeaway. I'm not saying it's the takeaway, but it's a takeaway.
Thank you.
Okay, Vayetze. Jacob leaves the land of Canaan. Vayetze, he went out. So let's give a little introduction to Vayetze. Vayetze is a very interesting parsha. First of all, it covers the span of 20 years from when Jacob leaves his father's home until he comes back 20 years later. When he leaves alone. Later in the next parsha, he's going to describe it, ki b'makli, I left only with my walking stick. So he leaves empty-handed, he's on the run, he doesn't have time to take 10 camels. Remember when Eliezer arrives in Haran to find a wife for Isaac, he shows up with 10 camels loaded with wealth. And just, to today, you show up, you just don't, all you need is your American Express card. Don't leave home without it. But in the olden days, if you want to show up and impress your prospective bride, you have to show up with literally camels holding the cash so they can see it. So it's a big deal to run to travel and load your camels with all your wealth, and that's what Eliezer does. But Jacob, when Jacob was because he's on the run, he's going to find a wife, but he's also on the run, so he pretty much is going empty-handed, and he only has his walking stick by his own telling of the story in the next parsha. And then he comes back 20 years later and he has 4 wives and he has 11 children and he has tremendous wealth. So there's a lot going on in this parsha. One of the things that is interesting about this parsha is that it is one long paragraph in the Torah, which is very unusual for a parsha this size. So I'm just looking at the article for a second. You know what? I'll show it to you in the Torah. This will be fun. Give me just 1 second. Okay, I'm sharing the Torah. I'm sharing the Torah the way it appears in the Torah. Appear to read the Torah. On the right column is the verses with the vowels and the cantillations and the numbers of the verses. On the left side of the way it appears in the Torah, if you notice, there's no just columns. There's no vowels. There's no cantillations. No periods. No punctuation. You have to do all this by heart. All you get is paragraph breaks. And paragraph breaks are very, very common. So I'm going to the previous page. Okay, no paragraph break in the previous page, but in the previous page, 1 paragraph break, another paragraph break. It's very common to have paragraph breaks, a few in every parsha. We discussed this in the past, but essentially what we call parsha, like the weekly portion, is not really called a parsha. It's really called a sedra. Sedra means seder, like Seder, like an order of paragraphs. A parsha is really a paragraph. A sedra is what we call what commonly people call a parsha is really a sedra, an order of paragraphs. Why am I showing this to you? Because in this parsha Vayetze, it starts Vayetze Yaakov leaves, and then you're going to have columns upon columns upon columns, and there is no break, all the way to the end of the story. The entire parsha is 1 paragraph. I don't think it happens again. Maybe it happens once more, but it's relatively unusual, right? It keeps going. And next page, keeps going. Next paragraph is also no breaks. Finally, the break happens. The break happens at the end of the parsha. The end of this week's parsha, and then Vayishlach is a new parsha. So we have an entire parsha. Let's see how many verses. 148 verses. That is a very long parsha. Your average parsha probably ranges from 90 verses to maybe 110 verses. This is 148 verses. This is a very long parsha, no breaks. So it's unusual. And it seems like what it's doing is it's covering the entire time that Isaac is outside of Israel. And this is something that's interesting about this parsha. This parsha, in some sense, is sort of the prototype of how a Jew will live and survive and ultimately thrive in exile. Because remember that we look at the book of Genesis, and especially Nachmanides would say that everything, quotes the Medrash, but he makes a big deal about this, that everything that happens to the patriarchs is really a sign for the children. In other words, the patriarchs are sort of paving the path, blazing the trail for what's going to happen later in Jewish history. And if you think about it, that both Abraham and Isaac, most of their life, at least from when the story and the narrative begins, they're living in Israel. Isaac never leaves Israel. Abraham, from when God tells him, Lech Lecha, from when the narrative starts in the Torah, where God says, go to the land of Israel, he's there the entire time. He just goes to Egypt for a very short while. And there also he's talked about exile. But that's Abraham as an individual person. Here you have the first person of the patriarchs, the first of the patriarchs, who is going to spend a significant amount of time in exile outside the land of Israel, is going to be Jacob. And it's a very difficult story because on one hand, it's difficult. He's in a difficult situation, and he's far from his homeland, and he's taken advantage of, and he's distant. And you're going to see all that play out in the next few verses, but also the entire parsha. But on the other hand, what ironic or what's a little bit counterintuitively, specifically in the distance, is where he is able, in the exile, he is able to raise a family. And what's astonishing, if you compare it to the two previous generations, it's astonishing is that even though not all of his children are perfect, many of them are far from perfect, and he has a lot of problems in the family, as we're going to read in 2 weeks with the sale of Joseph. But ultimately, all of his children, he has 100% success rate in keeping his children as part of his people. In other words, with Abraham is only successful with Isaac. Yishmael is not considered part of the Jewish people. And Abraham has other children also who drift away. He sends them to the east. He doesn't influence them. Isaac, of course, also only keeps Jacob as his the bearers of his legacy, and Esau sort of drifts away. He goes away from Israel. He goes to Edom and sort of checks out. And Jacob is the only one who is able to influence all 12 of his children. All 12 of his children remain loyal to his legacy. And ironically, the place where he's successful is not in Israel, but distant from Israel. So in some sense, that's the story of the exile. The story of the exile is there's a place of challenge, but that challenge brings along certain advantages. And there are certain things that happen throughout that can only happen in the exile. And the exile, ironically, our commitment to God could be stronger than when we are close to Israel. When we're in Israel, when we're close to God, we take everything for granted. That's why when the temple stood, people are serving idols. It's not a contradiction, right? Because sometimes when the distance brings out the deeper connection. And that's the story of Jacob in this parsha, entire parsha. But that's also the story of exile. And it's very important to understand the exile because Jewish people have been outside of Israel for more than 50% of their history, right? So we're a people that spent a lot of time outside of our homeland in hostile environments. And if we survive to tell the tale, it's because obviously we were able to overcome the challenges and in some ways even thrive or become stronger because of the challenges. And the place we understand this, the place we learn this, we understand, we appreciate this from the story of Jacob, and specifically from the story of Jacob in the portion of Vayetze, and how he does this. And what gives him the courage to do this, that we get in the portion of Vayetze, especially in the beginning, which is the vision. He goes to sleep and he has the vision of the ladder, et cetera, and the God divine promises to him. So we're going to get into all of that. But before that, just to set this up, this is a story about the Jew in exile, with the challenges, but also the advantages. So that's one way to look at this parsha. Once you understand this concept, so here, then you have the Kabbalists, and the Kabbalists talk about this idea, and they come at it from another angle, and they say, yes, it's the story of exile. But if you think about what's the original exile story? What's the original story where you say something or somebody is not in its native, comfortable environment? It's sent to a distant place, and there are challenges, and the challenges end up not only not harming this entity, but in fact making it stronger. So we have Jacob leaving Israel, but that's only one layer. There are deeper layers, and they say that the same thing applies to every soul. The soul begins in heaven. The soul descends to the physical world. In some sense, it's a tremendous, tremendous descent. It's the terrible exile. It's not in its natural environment. It's not in a place where it can express itself the way it did in heaven. It is burdened with battling the material world and material temptation. And in general, it loses a lot of its sensitivity to spirituality that it had in heaven. Excuse me. But on the other hand, why does God do this? God does this because there's certain advantages that come to the soul if the soul reaches, because it's distant. So it has to find a deeper connection to God. It has to dig deeper, and a deeper connection to God emerges, as we will discuss, and as is alluded to in Jacob's own vision and Jacob's prayer that follows. So we're going to read this parsha, but we have to understand that it's true on multiple levels. It's true in the exile of the soul, exile of Jacob from Israel. It's true historically, the Jewish people outside of Israel. It's true on the soul, that the soul is the one that descends from Be'er Sheva, from the land of Israel, goes to Haran. And again, the Kabbalists explain, what does Be'er Sheva mean? How does it allude to the soul leaving heaven, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to read all of this and try to look at this from multiple layers. This is just the general introduction to what we're about to do, God willing, in good health. And of course, once you have the general idea that's referring to the soul coming into the body, and then you have, that's the Kabbalists, and then you have the historic view that it's the story of exile, then you have the Hasidic view. Not so much Chabad Hasidism, but the Hasidim, if you think about the writings of the Hasidim, a lot of the writings of the Hasidim are about focus on Shabbat, because in the 19th century, life was very difficult, and people did not have a lot of time, a luxury to sit on Sunday morning and study Torah. But I'm saying for the masses, at least, many people. But Shabbat was a time that basically everybody was able to connect to holiness, to connect to spirituality. So there's a tremendous amount of writing in the Hasidic writings, more in the other Hasidim, not just Chabad, not Chabad, but there's a tremendous emphasis on Shabbat and inspiring people to relate to the holiness of Shabbat, etc. So it's not a surprise then that you're going to read this verse, and we're going to read that Jacob leaving Be'er Sheva and going to Haran also applies to the soul. So if it applies to the soul coming into the body, it also applies to the Jew leaving the holiness of Shabbat and going to the 6 days of the week. So Be'er Sheva, the well of 7, automatically alludes to Shabbat. So all I'm trying to say is everybody reads this verse in another way, but what they all have in common, this whole parsha, what they all have in common is it's the challenge of being away from your native space, and you would expect that it should be that when you return weaker than when you left. But the reality is Jacob comes back and he emerges stronger, and that's a prototype for Jews in exile. It's a prototype for the Jew moving from the holiness of Shabbat to the 6 weeks, 6 days of the week, and returning to Shabbat in a stronger spiritual state. And it also applies to, of course, the soul coming down to heaven, to this earth, And even though it's very challenging and very difficult for the soul, very painful for the soul, but what it gains in this world makes the journey worth it. So that's the story in short as a way of introduction. Now we could start going and reading the specific verses and try to read at least some of these verses with all these perspectives in mind. So here we go.
Question, Rabbi.
Yes, please.
I hope you don't mind going back a page or two, but I just find it a little intriguing that although Judith or Yudith was a Hittite, I would imagine that she had many virtues. Her name does become a fairly common Jewish name.
Yeah, so that is very interesting. Yehudit, that's very interesting. The only thing why I would stop short of saying that she was virtuous, if I knew nothing, if I just saw the name, I would say yes, she must be virtuous. Look, she has what a beautiful name, Yehudit. Yehudit comes from the word. We're going to have it in this week's parsha. The name Jew. Remember, the name Jew. We're coming from this Thanksgiving weekend, so it's time to remember that the name Jew means Thanksgiving. The name Jew comes from Judah, Yehuda. Leah names her third child Yehuda because she says, Hapam odeh et Hashem. This time I will thank God. Odeh is I will thank. Modim, modeh is to thank. Yehuda is to thank. Jew is to thank. So being Jewish is acknowledging and thanking, being aware of God's kindness to us. That's sort of embedded in our name. Now, it's interesting that for the first 1,000 years of Jewish history, we were not called Jews because Jews were only one tribe of the Jewish people. So we were called Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. We were called Israel, much more than Jew. We were only called Jew because at some point, about 2,700 years ago, the kingdom Israel splits. There's 10 tribes called the northern kingdom, and then there's the 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, which become Judea. And now the 2 kingdoms have 2 names. There's Judea and there's Israel. Judea in the south, Jerusalem and south, and Israel in the north. But then the 10 tribes are exiled about 200 years after the split. 10 tribes are exiled and lost. So now all we have is the southern kingdom, which is Judea, primarily Judah. There's also Benjamin, also people of other tribes, but it's primarily Judah. So we all became Jews because we're the survivors. So for the survivors, we pick our own name. But all I'm trying to say is the name Jew, it comes from the word acknowledging God. Acknowledging God. I guess you could say acknowledging negative things it would also be Judah. So if I knew nothing about these wives, I would say Yehudit is a beautiful name. It's a name of acknowledging God. She must be virtuous. And that's what we do sometimes when we have no information about somebody, about a character, we look at the name. The problem, of course, is that the verse says explicitly that these 2 women, Yehudit and what's her other name? The other one's name was Basmat. Yehudit, Yehudit and Basmat. Basmat is also a beautiful name. Basmat means besamim. Besamim is incense. It's what we smell on Saturday nights. We want to smell we want to smell it as a farewell to Shabbat. So these are beautiful, beautiful names. But the problem is, what am I going to do? That the verse says explicitly that they were a source of spiritual rebellion to Isaac and to Rebekah. That's the English translation in the Art Scroll, based on Rashi. So why they have those names is an interesting thing to explore. I'm going to have to look into it and see if anybody explains those names. I'll check it up. That'll be my homework. But it's clear from the verse itself that Rebekah and Isaac seem them to be spiritually rebelling, and according to the Medrash, they're serving they're idol worshippers. They never denounce idol worship. So that's the big problem. Okay, go ahead, Tom, please.
Good morning, Rabbi. In introducing Vayetze, you bring up a notion that instead of time being chronicled in linear fashion, us Jews look at things cyclically, from Shabbat to Shabbat, the Meraglim and all the Tisha B'Avs. I mean, what is the real significance here? Again, in the opening, exile, coming back, it's always suggestion that you go someplace and you go right back to where you started.
Right.
What is the true significance here?
So I think that, at least from the Hasidic view, and I'll be honest with you, I'm biased. I'm going to share the Hasidic view, is that it's cyclical, but it's not only cyclical. The cyclical would basically mean that you're starting and coming back to the same point. And if that's the case, there's no point. What's the point of the journey if you come back? And even if you're successful, right, there has to be, if you're taking risk, you have to have reward. If you invest and you assume risk and you come back to square one, so you didn't lose any money. If you didn't lose any money, there's no point of taking the risk. There's a Talmudic statement, even before you get to your investment advice. There's a Talmudic statement that says, a merchant, if you buy and sell for the same price, you're not a merchant. What's the point of investing money and coming out and you're back at the same spot? So the premise is that if you're going to travel, and if you're going to go out of your environment, if you're going to go into assume risk, you're going to have to gain. If there's no gain, there's no point. And there's different places where you could see in this week's parasha. So the basic point is that he comes back and he becomes a tremendously successful man, first of all, materially, but also with his children and his family. And 20 years pass and he's a changed person. And you have a very beautiful verse in the next parsha where he prays to God. He says, probably the most beautiful prayer in the Bible. I become small, I become diminished from all the kindness. In other words, I'm humbled from all the kindness. And he says, because when I left, I crossed the Jordan with a stick, and now I'm two camps. Because then he splits the camp because he's preparing for Isaac to confront Esau, and he's afraid. But this contrast, how I'm coming back. So you say it's a cycle. I'm coming back, but when I'm coming back, I'm not the same person as the person who left. So you have to do the cycle, but you come back on a higher level. The Baal Shem Tov had the metaphor is not the right word. I'm missing the word. Not a spiral, because spiral means going down, but that's the same idea. Spiral staircase. When you go on a spiral staircase, you're going around and around. So it's cyclical. But the point here is every time you come around to the same spot, you're in a higher dimension. So you are going round and round. You are leaving and coming back, but you're not coming back to the same spot. And that's how we think about time in some sense. We go through the Jewish calendar or even the weekly calendar. You're repeating itself. Today is Sunday again. Last week was Sunday. This week was Sunday. And the Kabbalah explains that we say in Hebrew, Sunday is day one. So we're back to day one, we're back to square one. Why don't we start counting days from the beginning of creation? And after day 7, it should be day 8, day 9, day 10. So it's not practical, but it's more than that. According to the Kabbalah, because every Sunday, the same energy of the first Sunday shines, and there are 7 sphirot. God has 7 emotional attributes. Each one is dominant on one day of the week, and Sunday is a day of kindness. So every Sunday, we're back to day 1 because it's the first sphira. So if every Sunday is the first sphira, so how are we advancing? Well, the answer is it's the spiral staircase. So we are today is the energy of kindness, but we have access to a deeper form of kindness. And God's attributes are infinite, and therefore the growth is infinite. But even though the growth is infinite, but we're still in the dimension of the 7 spheres. So now kindness can grow infinitely. And that's how we think about time in general, that it is cyclical. But it's not cyclical in the sense, it's sort of a combination of cyclical and linear. We are advancing, but we are circling. We're going through the same steps, but we're advancing. So how do you have that? So the visual is the spiral staircase, where you're moving up, but you're still moving around. You're coming to the same spot, but you're on a higher level.
So let me ask that question from the other way. Why not just linear, and why add in the dimension of cyclic?
So that's a good question, because linear, because I think because the message is you have to, everything in life is going to be what the origin is, where the Kabbalists refer to as ratzo and shuv, running and returning. And this comes, the first place it's written is the book of, it's in the Bible, in the vision of Yecheskel, the Chayot, the holy angels are running and returning. And it comes from Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation, the first Kabbalistic work. There's always the energy, the pulse of life. The pulse of life is the energy has to emerge and then come back. And that's the tension of life. You distance and you come back. And that tension is where growth could happen, because otherwise it's static. And growth is not linear. You don't just go from good to better. I mean, there's some growth that can go from good to better, but like you need more risk to have more reward. You have to have more challenge to be able to bring out a greater growth. And you have to lay on challenge, you have to lay on difficulty so that person can overcome it, or the concept can overcome it. And that's the basic cycle of life, the breath of life. You breathe, you exhale, you inhale. That's the origin of this concept of you go and you come back. And that tension of life, the distance and the coming back is where the tension happens, and the growth is where the tension happens. If there's no strain, if there's no challenge, then the growth would only be limited, right? If you want deeper growth, there has to be some degree of challenge, some degree of distance, and that tension is what allows for the growth. So the origin would be in the process of creation. This Ratzon Shov is running and returning, and according to the Kabbalists, this affects every area of creation. Even the energy that gives us life is in that model of running and returning, going and coming, call it what you want. But the point here is the pulse, distance and return. And that tension is what allows the growth, what allows for deeper growth, because that tension is what creates the challenge, because I'm in the distance, and then that distance could be fueled. But if there's no tension, if things are static, so you can have growth, but it's static growth. In other words, it's growth all within. It's not exponential growth. So that would be the Kabbalistic explanation of why you need the cycle, why you need the distance before you return, because the distance creates the tension. Now the tension then can be channeled to greater growth.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Toda rabah. Okay, so let's read a verse or two. At least we'll get the show started. Okay, verse 10, chapter, 28, I think? Chapter 28, verse 10. And Jacob left Be'er Sheva and he went to Haran. Not a perfect translation. Let's see how our scroll translates it. Jacob departed. That's how they say. Vayetze. Latzet is to go out. Jacob goes out of Be'er Sheva and he went to Haran. So what's Haran? Haran is the place of where his mother was from, and that's where he's going to find a wife. But he left Be'er Sheva. Now, what's interesting is that not always does the Torah tell us where the person, emphasize where the person emerges from. In other words, the classic verse when they leave Egypt, Vayered Avram Mitzrayim, when they leave Israel, Abraham descended to Egypt. Isaac went to Gerar, right? The emphasis, Jacob is leaving from Be'er Sheva, where he's leaving from, even though we know he's Be'er Sheva, if you do the math, you know that his father sat in Be'er Sheva. So if he's leaving his father, probably he's in Be'er Sheva. No, but the emphasis, he left Be'er Sheva and he went to Haran. And this gives a lot of all like I said before, going back to before, the way, many ways of reading this verse, but this is sort of has more deeper meaning. And the point here is that the only way that Jacob could be successful in Haran is if he remembers where he emerged from. That's his identity. I belong in Be'er Sheva, which is the southernmost city in Israel at the time. So in other words, someone that stops you in the street and say, "Where are you from?" That's a very profound question, because that means, how do you define your identity, right? I've been here for a while, but where am I from? What is my origin story? And for Jacob, the Torah emphasizes that Jacob left from Be'er Sheva. He went out of Be'er Sheva. But of course, but why is that important to know? We know where he was living before. We know it's important to know where he's going. No, you have to understand, if you want to have the success that Jacob was able to have despite the challenges, you have to remember your story. Where are you from? Where are you from is the question. Is that knowledge, that awareness is what's going to be able to allow you to thrive in your new environment. So you have to emerge from Be'er Sheva, always remember where you're from. And if you want to read this, like I said, the Hasidic way of reading, Jacob goes from Be'er Sheva, from Shabbat, the well of 7. Well represents fresh water. Well represents the holiness in the world. Shabbat is the well. Shabbat is where you have the reservoir of holiness. And then you go from the Be'er Sheva to Haran. Now the Medrash already says that Haran comes from the word Haron Af, God's wrath. It's a place where in some sense God is not happy there. So the point here is you're going from this tranquility of Shabbat, from the waters of Shabbat, and you're going to Haran, to a place of difficulty. Now, there's all kinds of spins on the word Haran. The Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad, has a play on the word Haran. The word Haran could mean Charon, which would mean God's wrath. It could also mean Nichar, Groni. King David in the book of Psalms talks about exile, and he talks about distance from Hashem, and he basically says, my throat has become dry. I can't speak. So Nichar is dry throat. You can't speak. And the mystics say, what is Shabbat? Shabbat is the time, the place where you sense that God created the world. That's what Shabbat is. You sense God's presence in the world. That's Shabbat. What is the weekday? In other words, times that are not necessarily spiritual. So that's when your throat is dry. Throat is dry means there's no speech. You can't speak. What does it mean you can't speak? So the words of Hashem that created the world, because remember, you look at the book of Genesis, God created the world with utterances, with Hashem, with the divine utterances. So God said, let there be light, and there was light. In other words, words and speech represents the idea that Hashem's energy creates the world. So if you could sense the words, you could sense Hashem's presence in the world. In the 6 days of creation, it's much harder to sense Hashem's presence because we're busy, we're distracted. We see natural order. We don't see the divine presence. So the 6 days of creation represents the dryness of the mouth, where the speech is not available. But Rabbi Shneur Zalman says that those same letters, charana, dried speech, dried mouth, no speech, could be transformed, and you rearrange the letters, and charan could become rina. There's a very, very small difference between charan and rina. It's a chet and a hey. Chet and a hey look the same, except there's one little chet has three lines. It's like 3 lines, and hey has those same 3 lines, but there's just a little missing space. So there's a very small difference, a crack of a little hole, a little needle hole. If you open up your reality just a little bit, you get from charan to rina, from dryness of the mouth, to a place where you don't see words, you don't see the meaning of creation, you don't see the divine presence, to a place of song. Rina is song. You just have to open up yourself a little bit, and then you see the world telling the story of God. So from no words to song is a very small change. And that's the difference between the 6 days and Shabbat. But when you emerge into the 6 days, from Shabbat, if you're coming from Be'er Sheva, if you're coming from the well of 7, if you could sense the holiness on Shabbat, then when you go to Haran in the 6 days, you transform the Haran to the Rina, you transform the dryness to the song. So again, we can get poetic, and I could talk about this for a long time, but that's one dimension. I want to talk about the dimension. I have 2 minutes left, 3 minutes left before questions. I want to talk about the dimension of leaving the soul descending from heaven to earth. And there too, there's a beautiful play on this verse, Be'er Sheva. The Medrash makes this point. Be'era shel Shvuah. What is Be'er Sheva? Why is it called Be'er Sheva? So there's 2 reasons. Well, Sheva has 2 meanings. Sheva comes from the word 7, and it also comes from the word oath. If you go back in the story, Abraham already made an oath here with Abimelech. They brought 7 sheep, and they made an oath. And the verse says that's why they called the name Be'er Sheva, because of the oath. So Sheva means oath. Sheva means 7 in modern Hebrew, but Shvuah, which is the root of Shvuah and Sheva, is also oath. And the Medrash makes this connection, but the Talmud says that before the soul descends into this world, they make the soul take an oath that it will be righteous. It's from the Talmud. It's actually the opening statement of the book of Tanya. Tanya means we learned in the Mishnah, we learned in the Braita, we learned in the teaching. Mashbi and I say, before the soul is born, we make the soul take an oath, be righteous and don't be wicked. And the whole Tanya is to figure out what's this oath doing. Okay, so there's this oath. Now, why an oath? Why would you make the soul swear that it's going to be righteous? So that's another story. Well, that could be explained because the word Sheva has three meanings. It means 7, it means oath, but it also means shin and sin, same letter. It means savea, to be satiated, to be satisfied, to be full. And the point here is that an oath is an empowerment. So when they make the soul swear, be tzaddik, be righteous, and don't be wicked, it's actually empowering the soul, giving it the energy to be able to withstand the difficulty and the challenges in this world. The bottom line is this. The bottom line is if you want to read the verse from the perspective of the Kabbalah, based on the Talmud, Vayetze Yaakov miBe'er Sheva, Jacob emerges from the Be'er, from the well of 7, from the well of the oath. And that refers to the soul coming down to Haran, to a place of anger. And then what are you going to do? Oh, how do you survive? That's next verse. The next verse is there's going to be a dream, there's going to be a ladder. And maybe the dream is the secret. Maybe the dream is the secret. What is a dream? A dream is somebody who is not willing to a dream is a dreamer. You dream. What does it mean? You're not settling with reality. Someone grounded in reality doesn't dream. I'm not having dreams. I just see reality as it is. The ability to dream is the ability to see beyond what is obvious. And from this point till the end of the book of Genesis, it's all about dreams. And the plot is only moved forward by the dreams. You have Joseph's dreams and you have Pharaoh's dreams, and everybody is dreaming. But in some sense, how do you survive through the exile? It's the dream. Because the dream means I'm not settling for reality. So that's one element. Then there's the element of prayer, which we're going to discuss, the element of the ladder, which we'll discuss. So this is all next week. How do I survive when I'm going to Haran, to the place of distance, to the place of wrath, to the place of dryness of the mouth, where there's no words, there's no story. I don't see any meaning in my existence. How do I transform that to a song, to Rina? Well, for that, you need the next verse. But again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to read this verse and this passage and this parsha in multiple layers. It's Jacob leaving Israel. It's the Jewish people, how they will survive in exile. It's the soul, how the soul would survive in its journey and descend into this world. And and within a person's personal life, how do I travel from the days in my life that are intensely holy, the Shabbat, to the days that I'm engaged in the physical world, surrounded with materialism, and that is the 6 days of the week. And first thing we said so far we said the first advice is we have to know, where are you from? What's your identity? I'm from Be'er Sheva. I represent the well. I represent Shabbat. I am the Shabbat Jew. To finish on this line, the one way the Hasidim put it is you have to ask yourself, am I a soul with a body, or am I a body with a soul? In other words, what's your primary identity? I understand you're in the physical world. I understand that you're here, but where are you from? What are you? You said, well, I identify, I am a soul. My soul has a body, so I happen to be here. Or you could say, no, I have a body. My material existence is primary. I also have a soul. I have times I dedicate to spirituality. But the question is, where are you from, is a very powerful question. And that awareness that I am essentially from Be'er Sheva. I'm essentially from Israel. I happen to be here, but that's not my true identity. Then I could thrive anywhere I am, because I'm always rooted to my source. So there's a lot more to say about this, and that we'll do that in the next verse, the next 2 verses. Thank you for joining. Have a wonderful day. And we should see each other in good health. And we should always see the music, because that's what Haran is. On the surface, it's just dry, no mouth, no words, no story, no meaning. But we can make this into a joyous occasion. Not just words, but song. Song is much more powerful than words. And that's the advantage that we get when we enter Haran. We make it into a song. So never stop singing, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a good week.
Thank you, Steve. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Lillian. Thank you. Okay.